My name is Alesh Shinkovitz. I work at Logos Public Affairs, and I cover the energy environment portfolio. What that basically means is that we deal with all the energy and environment law at EU level. So today I'll be guiding you through the 2020 package, as it's known. And whatever questions you have, please just submit them, and we can have a nice Q&A after the presentation. But to give you a little bit of context on why there is even an energy and climate policy at EU level, there's really two angles to this. One is on the climate side and one is on security of supply. So on climate, as of 1992 with the UN Framework Convention for Climate Change, there has been some push at the international level to come up with targets to limit anthropogenic, otherwise known as human-caused climate change. Kyoto was a continuation of that in 1997, and it stretched into the previous decade with its commitments. And this was kind of the launching pad for why there should be at more local level, so not just at international, but at really national or supranational implementation level, something done on climate change. On the energy side, it comes really from a security of supply issue. The EU has many resources, but in some ways, some more limited resources. So I see my connection was lost. I hope it comes back. But, so in the 1970s, there was an oil crisis, and prices fluctuated quite substantially. That was one reason why the EU and other countries would go towards this, to try to find solutions to avoid crises. I'm just trying to get back my screen. Okay, so from these two angles, the climate angle and the security of supply angle, there needed something to be done to try to guide legislation in this way. And the EU was not really competent for energy policy. It was still the member states up until the Treaty of Lisbon. So this is one of the areas where the Treaty of Lisbon gave the EU the right to propose legislation for member states to then adopt. And from this, we get this energy and climate package. Now, some further context is that Europe makes very long-reaching goals, and for now it's still part of Europe 2020. So it was a 10-year goal for jobs and growth from the time when it was being discussed till the year 2020, and so that's where the 2020 energy climate policy fits in. There were these overarching goals at EU level, and energy and climate was just one piece of that. So now if we, Hans, if you make me the presenter, I need to move the slide. So just briefly, at a high level, what the 2020 energy climate package is, it's a family of legislation. So everything, when you hear the words framework and package, they describe two different things. A framework is an agreement, and a sort of explicit agreement of what EU law should go into. So in this case, what the energy climate law should go into. Now, when it's referred to as a package, it's because it's a package of actual pieces of EU law, so directives in this case. And as you can see, the package really sets out the three key targets. 20% of EU energy should come from renewables, 20% improvement in energy efficiency, and a 20% cut in greenhouse gas emissions. So these targets were set in the framework in 2007, and then they started work on the directives and adopted them progressively. The Renewable Energy Directive in 2009, the Energy Efficiency Directive in 2012, the so-called Effort Sharing Decision in 2009, and ETS. ETS is something that keeps being revised. It first was adopted in 2005, and then it keeps changing for each trading period. And we'll get into that later, why it also is continually revised. So the reason these directives are formed is to actually implement the goals. So even within the framework, it could say something, a laudable goal, but you need an EU law like a directive or a regulation to implement that goal. And why 2020? It fits in two ways. One, marketing and communications. So you have to be aware that the target for reaching certain jobs and growth targets in 2020 is very easy then to translate it into a catchphrase like 2020 by 2020. So that's one reason why it's 20%. Much less to do with the science of it and much more with how you can sell the idea. And in parallel, also, if you take into account where the EU already started with where they were on track with renewables, efficiency, and emissions, the 20% goals are more easily reached than one would expect. And so it was really a kind of trick to start the ball rolling because they were achievable targets and it sounded great, but we'll see where it goes from there. So if we go into the Renewables Directive, this is the directive that's meant to promote renewables at EU level, and what it is meant to do is to fulfill that target of 20% overall in the EU. Now this means that each country can have different targets of their own, local targets, but overall the EU needs to attain a 20% share. So in 2010, as you see, it was roughly 10%, so they need to double the 2010 level. And separate to that, it's not just about energy from stationary applications, but also transport, that at least 10% of transport fuels would have to come from renewable sources by the end of this decade, which mainly translates to biofuels and what percentage of any fuel that's sold is mixed in with biofuels. So each country gets to set out its own targets and its own plans of how to achieve it. But then through the reporting method, the EU can guide them if it seems like the overall target won't be reached. And just to give you an example of different starting points and endpoints to see the disparity between some member states, Malta has a target of 10% renewables penetration, whereas Sweden has a target of 49%. And when you look at the progress, Sweden is almost on track, or actually already reaching 51% of renewables penetration. This mainly comes from very good national action plans. They have a lot of hydropower. They're going heavily into wind, waste to energy, whereas Malta is still lagging behind, even though they've doubled their capacity of renewables. I think as of last year, they're still only at 3.8%, so it's very slow going. And the country has not done much of its potential for solar or wind. In these national action plans, there need to be specific targets for all the different sectors, so electricity, heating and cooling, and transport. And they need to get the right mix of renewable technology, but it's completely up to the member state how to approach it, whether it's a feed-in tariff or some other form of subsidy, how to actually promote renewables within their plans to reach the targets. So the policy measures do vary quite a lot. It also depends on the makeup of the member states. Some are federal states, some are not. So it really depends, on the kind of local level how to approach it. You'll also see that part of the national action plans are so-called statistical transfers or joint projects. This is related to the fact that member states do cooperate when it comes to energy. They will cooperate more in the future, but some plants are co-owned by different companies in different member states, so they supply different markets. So it's just there to take into account that the geographical location of a source of energy isn't quite limited, by member state. Other than that, in their national action plan, they also have to make sure that the biofuels meet sustainability criteria, although that's still an ongoing argument with how you define sustainability criteria and how you check and report on that. The next area of the 2020 package is the improvement in energy efficiency. So if you look at the Energy Efficiency Directive, what it is meant to do is to ensure 20% of energy savings by 2020, which roughly represents an annual reduction of 1.5% in national energy sales. There's meant to be some minimum standards when it comes to efficiency of products in the so-called Eco-Design Directive. Every several years, there are so-called working plans in the Eco-Design Directive where they look into what products in a household or in a business could be addressed looking at energy savings. And these rules are updated fairly regularly to try to achieve savings. Each member state is meant to prepare, similar to the Renewable Energy Directive, a National Energy Efficiency Action Plan. And I mean, this final piece of information here about smart meters and for electricity and gas, this is just indicative. It really depends on how the legislation will be implemented. So if we look at the directive itself more closely, it's commonly referred to as a smorgasbord directive. The directive, even though it is meant to achieve this 20% target, has many, many different ideas within it because it's trying to address efficiency of many different areas, different types of products, different approaches. So in those national energy efficiency action plans, they're extremely open for member states to decide how to tackle it. They're meant to estimate the energy consumption and the measures they take, the improvements, and then calculate what the savings will end up being. Under the directive, every 3 years they're meant to update and check on the progress of these action plans. We'll go into that in the next slide of what it can contain, and so you'll see some of the shortcomings. But in these action plans, if you consider the implementation of the directive, so this directive was decided in 2012. There were 2 years for what's called transposition. And transposition means taking the law at EU level and putting it in member states' law books. So only in 2014 was it theoretically meant to be part of actual law. And then last year, they were meant to already start reporting on what has been achieved thus far, what have member states experienced, how is the directive going, is it being implemented, what are the drawbacks, the shortcomings. But actually last year, more than 16 member states were warned by the Commission for a lack of transposition. So many member states were failing their deadlines in transposing the law to national level. So even though we can, in many ways, see the energy savings that have happened, it's almost not certain, why they have happened. Which part of the directive has worked, which part has not. I mean, with time, it'll be much more obvious what is going wrong in the directive and what isn't. So if you look at these national measures, it's both for consumers and industry. So energy distributors or retail energy sales companies have to achieve 1.5% energy savings per year throughout the implementation. EU governments on all the buildings that they own, that are publicly owned, have to have renovations in at least 3% of either the building stock or the floor area that they occupy. And it's meant to empower consumers. So consumers are meant to have access to different energy saving schemes. So either some form of financing, either some form of information that they can read up on. And this data needs to be freely available so that the consumer at the end of the day can make the choice to benefit from energy savings. The directive is split into many different articles to try to capture these savings. One of the most important ones is the obligation schemes. So member states get to decide in their action plans how they expect consumers and industry to benefit from energy savings to achieve this 1.5% per year savings rate. But they are free to, the member states are free to adopt their own plan, and it's really not limited by by much except for the imagination, because it's not only about producing audits to figure out where the savings could be captured. It's not even just about subsidizing, in a way, potential savings, but there are so-called alternative measures that can be applied. So it's completely open for the member state to decide whether they would propose some energy relief or a CO2 tax that would take the place of a savings measure. So each member state, when they've transposed the law, has changed the directive to fit their own requirements. These could be different financial incentives, but there is no one main method to address efficiency all across the EU. And so per member state, it varies so widely that it's very difficult to grasp how the directive is working or not, and really how it could benefit. I mean, it seems that it could very much benefit through some simplification, because there are so many alternative measures that then counteract potential savings. The third part of the 2020 package is the 20% cut in greenhouse gas emissions. The EU has split this into two different sections. So one is ETS, and the other is referred to as simply as non-ETS. The ETS, the emissions trading scheme or the emissions trading system, is meant to address all the large-scale facilities and industry sectors that use energy within the EU. Now, this could also take into account aviation and maritime, but for now, it's not yet in there. So aviation has escaped falling under the ETS system. This could change after 2020. There is clear reason to, because of the growth in emissions in the aviation sector, that the EU is looking into how to involve aviation, but for now it is exempt. When it comes to maritime, it is also exempt except for monitoring, reporting, and verification. So the emissions are monitored, there's clear tabulation, they're checked, but there are no limits per se. So with time, this could very well change, but for now, it's really the kind of industrial facilities in the EU that are covered by the ETS. And if you look at the emissions within the EU, the industrial sector represents 45% of the emissions. So there's about 11,000 power stations across the countries, and there's some countries that are also connected to the ETS system within the European Economic Area. So the target for 2020 is for these ETS sectors, as they're known, to be cut down by 21%. It is and it isn't happening. So it was launched in 2005, already before the 2020 package had become really a package. But the ETS is revised every several years because it's deemed that it's not really working. It's not delivering the kind of emissions reductions or the innovation capacity that it should be. So in 2009, it was revised also primarily because of the economic crisis that happened. I mean, that changed the ETS. So to keep it simple to understand, in this trading system, there are CO2 allowances. So a company would have to pay for a ton of CO2 to be allowed to emit it. And then there's various reasons, ways of how to either escape that obligation. You're not actually escaping the obligation, but in the beginning there was a transition period foreseen, so most of the allowances were given away for free to the supposed actual production level of those facilities. And then with time, they wanted to limit the number of free allowances and auction most of it so that industry is able to transition from a non-ETS system to one where they have to pay for CO2. And it's still foreseen that the best performers, the most energy efficient installations are covered by free allocation. But because of the economic crisis, there was a drop in emissions simply because of a drop in economic activity. And so this has had a constant negative effect on the ETS system. So now we're in the third trading phase, and from 2020 onwards, it'll be the fourth trading phase. Don't want to go into much more, but if you have questions, I'd be happy to answer them. So non-ETS. The non-ETS sectors are all the sectors that are not covered by the ETS. So that would include buildings, agriculture, waste, and transport. But transport, not including aviation and maritime. Aviation and maritime, like was said previously, they do fall under ETS but are generally exempt. Transport, in this sense, mainly means road transport. The name of the non-ETS sector, which represents 50% of EU emissions, it's called the effort sharing decision. So it shouldn't just be the industrial installations that pay for CO2 or become more efficient so they expend less CO2 in their process, but it's also the other sectors because they do represent more than half of all emissions. So there is a very target because of the difference in development of different member states. So the most developed countries, they have to lower their emissions by 20%, and the least developed ones can still have their emissions rise, but not rise as much, and should still see where they could limit their emissions. Progress is monitored yearly. If we just go quickly, I mean, the effort sharing decision is kind of like another smorgasbord like the Energy Efficiency Directive. I mean, it covers widely different aspects. But from that decision, with those headline targets, other directives or regulation is created. So when it comes to something like transport, it would be called CO2 cars and vans. So there would be a limit on how much CO2 a car or a van can produce on average per kilometer of driving. So in each of these sectors, there are usually specific directives or regulations that then implement the overall headline targets. Part of actually achieving this and helping accelerate the process of energy efficiency and innovation is funding support. So for now, there is something called the NER 300 fund, where there's about 300 million euro for renewables and carbon capture and storage. So looking at industrial sectors, looking at the challenges that are faced by member states trying to take this first step in the energy transition, there is a specific funding line to try to launch some, not quite blue sky, but near market or different possibilities of either renewable technology or CCS. And then within Horizon 2020, Horizon 2020 is the continuation of the so-called framework program, which is the research and innovation program at EU level. And within Horizon 2020, specifically under the energy challenge, there is just under 6 billion euro dedicated to various aspects over the next, MFF, so over 7 years in a way if you count the full span. And each year there are separate calls. Many are linked to energy efficiency, low carbon technologies, and smart cities and communities, where companies or consortia of companies could apply to receive funding to help them realize these emission savings. To just get a snapshot of progress when it comes to achieving the targets, renewables and efficiency are somewhat diverging. And when it comes to emissions itself, the third target, it's more difficult to say why emissions have dropped or not, and I'll explain why. So when it comes to renewables, it seems that most countries are achieving their interim targets. And in 2014, the projected share was 15.3% of renewables in the gross final energy consumption. What is lagging behind is transport. So 5.7% is not really on target for 2020 being 10%, but at least for renewable installations in general, the targets seem to be met. There is quite wide disparity, though. I mean, earlier I gave the example of Malta and Sweden. Those are really the two outliers. Sweden will have already achieved 50% of renewables penetration, unlike some others who only have a 20% target. Malta only has a target of 10%. Other lower bound ones are countries like the UK. When it comes to efficiency, the final energy consumption decreased by 7% over sort of the previous 8 years up to 2013, and the primary energy consumption also decreased by 8%. So from these numbers, when you look at them across the graph, it seems like the EU will need to accelerate to be able to achieve its 20% efficiency increase. But when it comes to emissions, it's more of an open question. Because of the economic crisis and because of a lack of growth, it's difficult to say whether the emissions reductions are quite necessarily because of these plans, or is it also because of the economic hardship that some companies are having. So if we just look into what's next, until 2020, what has been agreed to is the 2030 framework. So as I mentioned before, first it's a framework with the headline targets, and then it will become a package when the directives are updated for the 2020 to 2030 timing. So already this year, the energy efficiency directive, the renewables directive will be revised for the post-2020 period. Now, if we look at the targets for 2030, it's at least 40% greenhouse gas emissions reduction, and renewables and energy efficiency are at 27%. Here we see two divergences. One is in the messaging. So 2020 had the 20% figure, 2030 doesn't seem to have 30% figures. So if you see the marketing communication does not match with the earlier one, there are a couple reasons for this. One is that the low-hanging fruit by 2020 will have been so-called captured, and so it's more difficult. I mean, it's still not that difficult, but it is more difficult, more of a choice to go up to 30%. And once renewables penetration is closer to 30%, it actually represents about 50% of final energy consumption. So at that stage, there are more disruptions. This doesn't mean it's negative. It just means that other things need to be taken into account, like market design. So it will have an impact in areas that it isn't yet having an impact now. And that seems to be the reason why there is some hesitation to take those targets even further. Now, what is important is to then look at that and consider the 2050 low-carbon roadmap, by which point there is meant to be an 80 to 95% emissions reduction, depending on the scenario and the sector. But if you look at the current 2030 targets, it doesn't really capture that 2050 long-term target. So we'll see if in the directives itself it changes. That's all. So thank you for your time. I would be happy to answer direct questions on the directives themselves, the 2020 package in any kind of detail. So please let me know any questions that you have, and I'll be sure to answer them now.